The late 1970s didn't just belong to disco. They belonged to the Bee Gees. Three brothers from the Isle of Man and Australia had already tasted chart success in the 60s, but nothing prepared them for the cultural takeover they engineered in the second half of the 70s. With Saturday Night Fever, they didn't just write songs, they defined an era. Every radio station, every nightclub, every street corner seemed to echo their high harmonies and pulsating rhythms. They became the face, the voice, and the soundtrack of disco itself. But in the same breath, they became a lightning rod for the genre's downfall. The more they dominated the airwaves, the more resentment brewed under the surface. To many, they represented the very excesses of disco: glossy, commercial, and unstoppable. And when the backlash came, it came with a vengeance. It started subtly. Critics began accusing them of saturating the charts, of writing too many hits for themselves and for others. Their work for other artists, from Barbra Streisand to Diana Ross, kept them inescapable. What was once admiration began morphing into irritation. Some rock fans viewed disco as an attack on the authenticity of guitar-driven music, and the Bee Gees were cast as the masterminds of the invasion. Inside the group, the pressure was immense. Barry, the oldest, was the de facto leader, steering their sound into the heart of the disco craze. Robin, with his distinctive tremolo voice, felt sidelined at times, questioning the band's creative direction. Maurice, the mediator, struggled to keep the peace. As the hits piled up, so did the tension. The brothers argued over songwriting credits, lead vocals, and the relentless schedule that kept them trapped in recording studios and promotional tours. Yet, in 1977, there was no sign of the storm that was coming. Saturday Night Fever exploded beyond anyone's expectations. The film was a hit, but its soundtrack became a cultural bomb, selling tens of millions of copies worldwide. The Bee Gees weren't just on the charts, they were the charts. In early 1978, they held the #1 spot for months, with their songs dominating half the Billboard Top 10 at the same time. That kind of dominance was unprecedented and dangerous. The resentment reached its boiling point in 1979. In Chicago, a radio DJ named Steve Dahl launched an anti-disco crusade, fueled by rock fans who felt pushed out of the music conversation. It culminated in the infamous Disco Demolition Night, when a crate of disco records was blown up in the middle of a baseball field. The crowd turned violent, and the scene made headlines across the world. Even though the Bee Gees had nothing to do with the event directly, they were the symbolic targets. To the anti-disco movement, destroying disco meant destroying the Bee Gees. Overnight, radio programmers began avoiding their music. Stations that had once played their hits on repeat suddenly treated them like a plague. Concert attendance dipped, and critics who once praised their songwriting now mocked them as relics of a fad. The Bee Gees, who had just been on top of the world, found themselves locked out of it. Internally, the brothers wrestled with their next move. Barry wanted to adapt, to pivot away from disco and re-establish themselves as songwriters for other artists. Robin wanted to fight back creatively to prove they could survive any trend. Maurice, worn down by years of non-stop work, wanted peace above all else. Their disagreements over the band's identity spilled into tense recording sessions, where every decision was second-guessed and every track felt like a test. The shift was brutal. By the early 80s, the Bee Gees were virtually invisible on U.S. radio. Even their ballads, far removed from the disco beat, were dismissed because of their association with the genre. Their name had become radioactive. To survive, they retreated into the background, writing and producing for others. This behind-the-scenes work kept them relevant, but it also underscored how far they'd fallen from their disco-era heights. What made the fall even more painful was that it wasn't just about music trends. The Bee Gees had become cultural scapegoats. Every joke about disco, every insult about its supposed lack of substance seemed to have their names attached. For three brothers who had built their careers on resilience, it was a public humiliation they couldn't simply brush off. Yet their bond, tested by fame and ego, refused to break entirely. Through the 80s, they slowly rebuilt their image, avoiding the disco label while embracing new sounds. In the 90s, nostalgia began to soften the backlash. Suddenly, the Bee Gees were being celebrated again, not just for disco, but for their decades of songwriting excellence. They were invited to perform on prestigious stages, honored by peers who had once turned their backs. But the scars remained. Even in interviews years later, they admitted the disco backlash had been the most traumatic moment of their career. It wasn't just the loss of commercial success. It was the feeling of being hated for the very thing they'd worked so hard to create. The story of the Bee Gees' disco era is a lesson in the double-edged nature of success. They reached a level of cultural dominance that few artists in history have ever touched. But with that dominance came a target on their backs, one that grew larger with every hit song. And when the wave of backlash finally crashed, it didn't just take down a genre, it nearly took down the Bee Gees themselves. Their legacy today is more balanced. They are recognized as masters of harmony, prolific songwriters, and survivors of the music industry's harshest cycles. But the memory of that dizzying rise and crushing fall in the disco era will always be the defining chapter in their story. The moment when three brothers ruled the world, and the world decided it had had enough. The biggest turning point in the internal conflict of the disco industry came when traditional rock radio began openly opposing the genre. Several well-known DJs launched anti-disco campaigns, with the Bee Gees becoming the prime target. While many didn't personally hate the Gibb brothers, the public image that formed painted them as the villains of music, accused of ruining the world of rock. This attack not only hurt their sales in America, but also began to chip away at the band's morale. The pressure was worsened by the media's tendency to look for ways to stir the pot. Any statement from Barry, Robin, or Maurice was often twisted to spark drama. Suspicion began to creep in among the three, not because they didn't trust one another, but because they feared that even a small comment could become fresh ammunition for critics. Behind the scenes, their record label also started to hesitate about pushing the Bee Gees as the face of disco. The music market was shifting toward new waves like punk and new wave, and executives feared that being too closely tied to disco would hurt profits. As a result, the Bee Gees felt a sharp decline in support, even though they still held record-breaking sales numbers. Ironically, even as they became the victims of backlash, the Bee Gees were still asked to perform at major disco-themed events, almost as if they were being squeezed for their popularity, while simultaneously blamed for the genre's downfall. This strained their relationships with certain promoters and media outlets. Some shows were abruptly canceled due to security threats, and planned boycotts from hardcore rock fans. Tensions reached their peak during the Disco Demolition Night in Chicago in 1979, when thousands of disco records were burned at a stadium. Although the Bee Gees weren't present, the event became a symbol of public hatred toward the genre they represented. Barry Gibb later admitted that the incident made them feel ostracized from much of the American music world. After disco's collapse, the Bee Gees were forced to change their strategy. They began writing songs for other artists, such as Barbara Streisand, Dionne Warwick, and Kenny Rogers. Ironically, even with their name pulled from the spotlight, their compositions continued to dominate the charts, proving that their talent had never faded, only buried beneath the controversy. Still, the wounds from that era never fully healed. For the Bee Gees, the disco era was both a time of incredible triumph and their harshest test. They experienced unmatched global fame, but also learned how quickly the music world could turn praise into ridicule. And though they survived, the shadow of the disco-era controversy would forever remain part of the Bee Gees' story.